Hey everyone, it's Dr. Tara, and I am so excited to host and welcome you to this week's edition of Dr. Tara Tuesdays. We are spending or dedicating the month of February to self-love is the best love. So this is part 3 of our Self-Love is the Best Love series, learning to walk in healthy relationships. And this topic is so important to me because, hey, everyone, if you're just joining in, welcome to Dr. Tara Tuesdays. This topic is so important to me because when we think about self-love is the best love, one of the things that has to be a part of our self-love practice is understanding what boundaries are, understanding what boundaries look like for us, both from ourselves to ourselves, and then also as it relates to our relationships with others. And so, hey, Nikki. And so as we get started today, I'm going to actually be talking about, thank you, Chima. So as we get started today, one of the things that I wanted to do, just understanding that this is such a broad topic, we're going to be breaking it down into 3 parts. And it's important that we all understand that when I talk about leaving unhealthy relationships, I'm not going to just be limiting it to intimate relationships. We're going to be talking about friendships, family relationships, because I think that they set the standard and they set the stage for so many other relationships. And oftentimes, how we interact in one relationship is often mirrored in different relationships as well. I'm trying to wave to everybody. And so it's going to be 3 parts tonight. So first part 1 is, how did I get here? And so when we think about how did I get here, one of the things that we have to understand is, what have I been taught about relationships? Natalie, I'm about to die laughing at your comment. So when we think about how I've been taught about what I've been taught about relationships, so let's break it down. And one of the things that, if you have a chance to get a piece of pen and paper, please do so, because I am going to be asking questions to you all that you may not have the answers right now, but you may want to spend some time reflecting on the answers, so that you can go back and give yourself time to process your own individual answers. So, hey, everyone, if you're joining in, thank you for tuning into Dr. Tara Tuesdays. We're going to get started right away. So, learning to walk away from unhealthy relationships. Question 1 is, how did I get here? And that requires some serious reflection. And when I talk about how did I get here, really starting to ask ourselves the question, what have I been taught about relationships? Meaning, are there clear roles? So for many of us, we've been taught that relationships kind of go in this pattern of, there is a clear leader, there's a clear follower. Some of us have been taught that relationships go in this pattern of, there's a clear giver, there's a clear taker. If you feel that way, give a thumbs up. And so understanding what I've been taught about relationships, and then from that point, or from that question, asking ourselves, what role have I been taught to assume in my relationships? So interesting thing about me, I am a natural giver. Like, I like to make people feel good. I'm a cheerleader. I like to cheer people on. And so in relationships, I also like to be a giver. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with either of these roles. However, one of the things that we have to ask ourselves, and Chima, thank you for writing the question down, in that role analysis, or in that role reflection, the question that we have to ask about, how have I been taught to view relationships in general? And again, whether this is intimate, whether this is friends, family, or whatever, is, have I been taught to view relationships from a place of power or a place of partnership? And so when we think about that, and Aria, you're absolutely right. Natural nurture is a gift and a curse, because what happens is, if I've been taught, or if the person I'm with, whether it's, again, whoever that person is, and I'm making them kind of irrelevant to the conversation, because this is about self-love, is, if relationships that I'm in come from a place of power, then you're going to have a natural imbalance, right? So if I'm a natural follower, if I'm usually saying, you know what, hey, you take the lead. I don't mind where we go eat today. You want to go to this movie? It doesn't matter. That's great. If that's from a place of partnership, then I'm going to feel good about giving up some of this control, right? Because it's a shared power. That power doesn't come with repercussions. When or it's because it's shared partnership, that power doesn't come with repercussions. However, when I've been taught, or when am in or entering relationships where there's a power differential over a partnership, one of the things that happens is that whatever my role is, whether it's a leader, whether it's a giver, whether it's a taker, gets skewed in the lens of power. And so what happens with power is that it becomes a struggle between two people setting boundaries. And that goes right into Christina's comment about selfless partners can be just as unhealthy as selfish ones, especially if my selflessness comes with reminders, right? That's a power relationship. If I have to remind you that I did this for you, right? Remember last Tuesday, I did this. Remember you needed this, and I did this, and I gave this to you, and I did this, and I made myself available. And so when I'm in that space, then I have entered into a relationship that is based on power. Now, when I notice that, there is a clear opportunity for some readjustments to be made. And a lot of times, too, when we think about how we got here, a lot of us got here organically, right? Because a lot of times with many of us thinking about childhood relationships, parent-child relationships, a lot of those are built on power differentials. You do what I say, this is what I'm doing for you, I'm going to remind you about that. So it's a very natural progression. So I want us to look at this lens, or look at this conversation through the lens of compassion for ourselves too. And so understanding that, but asking ourselves a question, how did I get here? What have I been taught about relationships? And have I been taught to view relationships from a place of power or partnership? And so when I'm thinking about this power versus partnerships, and Maurice, to answer your question, how are we taught? So we are taught, and you're answering yourself. I think I've just flowed in relationships. So even in that flowing, I'm being taught about roles, right? I'm being taught about, in a friendship, a friendship means this, right? I have my own definition of that. A family relationship means this. An intimate relationship means this. It means that this person does this, and it means that this person does that. And a lot of times those roles are unspoken until there's an issue, or until somebody does something that the other person doesn't approve of. And so when we think about that, and Chima, you hit it on the head too, relationships can be skewed because of trauma, because of abuse, because of power struggles too. And that goes into the next part of that, is understanding how we've been taught to measure love. Now, a lot of us have been taught to measure love through a subjective lens, right? So you love me if you do this. You love me if you take the trash out regularly. You love me if you get me something for Valentine's Day. You love me if you do these things. And so when we're talking about looking at relationships through the lens of processing whether or not this is a place where I want to stay, one of the things that I want us to allow ourselves to take off the table is the notion of love, because a lot of times love becomes easy to defend, right? So I can tell someone, you don't love me. And then their natural response usually isn't, you know what, Tara, you're right, I really don't love you. It's going to be, yes, I do. Of course I do. How can you say that? And so it goes back and forth, and it doesn't really get us to solving or addressing whatever the issue is. And so what I want us to ask ourselves is, okay, I'm going to give that person love. Yes, they love me, they care about me, fine. The next question as a result of that is it being shown in a way that's healthy? And that's usually a very clear yes or no. Is the love being shown in a way that's healthy for me? And if I can say, let me back it up. If I can't say yes, then it's a no. Right? Because a lot of times that leads us into the next part. Part two is, why am I staying? So part one is, how did I get here? Part two is, why am I staying? And so a lot of times when we're talking about, is this love being shown in a way that's healthy? If there's a pause, if I cannot say hell yes, then it's a hell no. And that's okay. I want to bring that in for further reflection, because I'm a big fan of lists. And so then we have to ask ourselves the question, well, why am I staying? Right? If there are parts of our relationship where love is being shown to me that's unhealthy for me. And when we talk about health, what that means is that I feel less than. I feel that there's a gap. I feel that there's a void. I feel that we are stuck in a power struggle. And so when we find ourselves in that power struggle versus a partnership, what we usually find is like almost these needs, right? So instead of the need to feel safe, it's usually the need to convince, the need to be right, the need to judge, or the need to fix. And so when we talk about understanding that, then we want to start to list out pros and cons. I'm a big fan of lists because a lot of times our thoughts can just ruminate, meaning that they can occur just over and over and over again. And I don't ever get to any kind of solution. I'm just kind of replaying different situations, different scenarios. You know, I started out being upset because you left something on the floor, and now I'm mad about something that you did 4 years ago, or that time you didn't invite me to somebody's party, right? So these thoughts, the interesting thing about our thoughts is that they just lead to another thought. And so when we talk about part 2 about why am I staying, literally listing out pros and cons. And so for some of us, one of the main reasons why people stay in any type of relationship is history, right? You've always been my sister. We've been homegirls since the 5th grade. We've been together for the past 13 years. If I'm in a romantic relationship, we may have children. There may be familial pressures or societal pressures. Understanding what those reasons are and understanding if those reasons for pros are internal or external. Because then I have to see, am I sacrificing myself in order to sustain this relationship? And one of the things that causes us to do is justify or rationalize unhealthy behaviors, right? So I get into what I call lowered expectations, which often come from unhealthy relationships. So we tend to either view or judge our relationships from this lens of lack. So we tend to say things like, you know, it's not that bad, or I remember when, you know, we got along, or I remember this, or it's not as bad as so-and-so. And so we don't really look at our relationships for its potential. We look at it based on how tolerant am I willing to be of dysfunction, right? Well, at least it's not this. And so what that does, I'm going to go trauma informed here. What that does is that it creates this trauma tolerance. Thank you, Shantia. Meaning that whereas when I entered into this relationship, or whereas when I call it, you know, our inner being, our conscious, or whatever else, when I entered into this relationship, I could feel when things were off, right? We have this beautiful brain-body connection, right? When you said this thing to me, I did, ooh, I felt it in my stomach, or, you know, I felt, you know, my head starting to hurt. But I start to literally build up over time what we call this trauma tolerance. So I'm beginning to tolerate more and more instances of unhealthy behavior that allow me to justify staying in this relationship. And one of the things that we also often do too is then we begin to judge ourselves, right? Especially, and I know Aria said too, that, you know, I'm a natural nurturer. So natural nurturers become fixers, right? If I'm a nurturer, but I'm in a relationship oftentimes built on power, then I've entered into a situation where both the person I'm in this relationship with, whether it's, again, a partner, spouse, friend, or whatever, we have this kind of unspoken agreement that my job or my role, again, understanding what our roles are, is to then fix you. And so one of the things that we often see is that, and give me a thumbs up if you've ever been here, that I begin to rate, or I begin to rate the status or the nature of my relationship based on my ability to make things better. And so when we understand that, then what happens is that the relationship, again, has that power differential. And we then create these situations where the relationship is then based on my ability to exhaust or sacrifice myself in the name of sustaining that relationship. And so another reason why we stay is that just as human beings, we judge ourselves, we identify ourselves based on our roles in relationships, right? So many of you know I'm divorced. And so when I was married, I was a wife, right? That was my role in relationship. I'm a mom, so my role is a mom. And so part of undoing certain relationships require us to identify ourselves within the relationship without this title. And a lot of times, and Chima, you hit the nail right on the head, it's fear, right? I am staying because I'm scared to identify myself as something else outside of this role. And And we have to deal with that. We have to sit with that, and we have to process that, because part of our identity, or part of the grieving process, which we're going to talk about when we get into the learning to walk away piece, is allowing ourselves to grieve the role, whatever perceived role we're giving up, and allowing ourselves to create a new identity. So many of us stay in relationships that are not healthy, or not fulfilling, or not serving to who we are as people, and who we are, individually, because I want to maintain this role, and understanding that if I give this role up, there's something that I can replace it with. Again, if I'm used to looking at relationships through the lens of lack, I'm also used to looking at myself through that lens of lack as well, right? Again, you can't have abundance thinking over here and lack thinking over here. It's not possible. And so if I'm looking at this relationship as it's not all bad, or, I'm justifying this or I'm justifying that, then I'm also looking at myself through that same lens of lack, meaning that I cannot see myself outside of this relationship. And so that allows us, and again, allowing myself to admit that I'm scared to create another role for myself. I'm scared to see myself outside of this identity in which this relationship gives me. And so part 3 of learning to walk away is just that, allowing this to be a process over an event. So we all know those stories that we see, like, I'm cutting people off and I'm doing this exactly and I'm doing this. And realistically, when we talk about learning to walk away, a lot of times what gets us stuck is that there is a connection. Again, what we talk about, those pros and cons, there is a connection. And so when we allow ourselves to engage in a process over an event, what I'm allowing myself to do is acknowledge and honor that usually this is a thought process that builds up over time. And so as I'm engaging in this thought process, or as I'm engaging in this process, one of the things that I'm a big fan of lists, writing it down, getting it out of my mind, getting it out of my heart, and putting it on paper so that I can see what I truly want, is what are my must-haves, right? What are my must-haves? And the second part of that is, how do I define them specifically? So one of the things that people often say is that, in relationships, my must-have is respect. I have no idea what that means, right? Respect is cultural. Respect is based on age. Respect is based on who raised you. Respect is based on geographic location, right? Some of us, respect is yeah. Some of us, respect is yes, right? Literally things like that. And so I want to know what respect means to me. And the reason why I say this is because a lot of times within relationships that are unhealthy, we tend to, and again, especially and I saw so many people agree with Aria's comment earlier about that nurturer. So many of us identify ourselves as givers or nurturers. And so in giving and nurturing within a power relationship, I've become, again, that fixer. And so what I've learned to do is sacrifice myself in order to maintain the relationship. And so a lot of us don't even know how to answer the question, what does this look like to me, right? What does respect look like to me? One of my big questions to people when they talk about safety, what does safety look and feel like to me? What does joy look and feel like to me? Joy for one of us may mean staying in the house. Joy for somebody else may mean I'm going out every Wednesday. That's going to cause issues, right? Joy for some friendships mean that we check in once a week. Somebody else, it means that I check in every day. And so when we allow ourselves to understand that this is a process, one of the things that also comes in is this notion of self-compassion. And the reason why self-compassion is important is because a lot of times when I am in an unhealthy relationship, judgment has come in. And so it becomes a notion of, when we talk, and Chima, you hit it on that, you talked about it too. Fear turns into anger, fear turns into self-judgment, right? So I was so stupid. I was so stupid to stay here. I was so stupid to be a part of this. I should have left such and such. And the reality of it is that you're here because you're here. So I'm going to go mindfulness, right? You're here because you're here. And you're here because there's an opportunity for you to do something different. And so when we talk about how do I want to feel in a relationship, so what is it that I need? What are my must-haves? And then the second question is, when we talk about allowing this to be a process and learning to walk away, is how do I want to feel in a relationship? These are two very, very important questions to ask ourselves, because the goal then, and this is a part of that self-love is the best love, is how can I start giving that to myself now? And so, Alicia, yeah, thank you for your transparency. It's okay. And so the reason why this is crucial is because that if someone or something were to show up, right, that a relationship comes along that brings respect, that brings joy, that brings honesty, that brings transparency, that brings, fulfillment in some type of way. And I haven't normalized that, or I haven't allowed myself to receive it, I'm going to reject the thing that I want. Right? We call it self-sabotage. We call it, not being ready for what you want. People call it blocking your blessings. All of it is true. Whatever you want to call it is true. And so when we talk about how do I want to feel in a relationship, the goal then becomes for us, how then do I make steps to give it to myself? Which is why that process over event is so important, right? Because in this process, I can start doing things in my day to day that allow myself to receive what it is that I need in a relationship, right? So if I need honesty, then how can I work on being more honest with myself, right? If I need respect, how can I work on giving myself that respect as I define it? Because one of the things that happens in unhealthy relationships is that chaos has been normalized. And I'll literally wonder why someone is being nice to me, right? Or why someone wants to give me something. If I'm a natural giver and I meet another giver, I'm going to be looking at your gifts like, what? What is your intention, or what are your intentions? And so understanding that in order for me to move from an unhealthy relationship to a healthy relationship, I have to insert healthiness where I am now. There is this notion, almost like this if-then notion that so many of us have, like, if I get out of this, then this will happen. And to me, nothing can be further from the truth, because there's this book that I love called Wherever You Go, There You Are, right? We take ourselves with us everywhere we go. And if I have not healed from a relationship that is unhealthy, I'm going to take those same traits. And even if I was in the right, because, one of the things about unhealthy relationships, a lot of times people create events through justification, right? So it becomes a quick shut off because I'm justified in feeling the way that I feel. I'm justified in you being wrong and me being right. But then I sacrifice peace, right? Because then I hold on to that anger, and I hold on to that lack of forgiveness, and I hold on to me not allowing myself to heal, because in that justification, in order for that justification to keep going, it has to breed rage, it has to breed entitlement, it has to breed judgment, it has to breed resentment. And so when I've normalized that, then one thing that I have not normalized or not learned how to accept is how do I want to feel in relationships, and can I give this to myself in the present moment? One of the things that I also want to acknowledge too, when we talk about learning how to leave unhealthy relationships, is the very, very real question too. And again, writing this down and giving ourselves an option, or an opportunity rather, to reflect: is the walking away permanent, or is it temporary? And the reason why this is important is because sometimes relationships become unhealthy because there's space needed. People need to figure out who they are, what they want. And I just want to say that, because if the relationship can be saved, then one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, what needs to change on both parts, right? So if I am a natural giver, and I just want to go off of the comment that was made, then it's part of my work not coming in to save, right? It's part of my work allowing this person that I'm in this relationship with to do things on their own. It's part of my work allowing them the space to figure out what they want. Christine, I want to go to your comment. What if one partner is further along in the healing process? Should people try to be in similar places in healing process? So it's beautiful if people are evenly and equally yoked. It is beautiful. I think my response to that question would be, we are allowed our own process. Part of the, and it depends on what my must-haves are. Let me say that. So if my must-have is having a partner who is emotionally available to me, and you're in your healing process and you are not there, and part of your healing, part of your work is, or part of where you are not yet still rejects that part of me, then that's a question. However, if we both acknowledge that we're in our healing process, then the goal then becomes, instead of looking specifically at where you are versus where I am, is going more general. are there things where we are evenly lined up on? And in this process, if we're allowing each other the opportunity to go through this process together, can we agree that we will meet there, right? So maybe you're not able to give me the emotional support as I define it specifically, but you can check in with me after you get off of work or in the morning before you go to work, right? That's still a part of the emotional healing process. And so if we can allow ourselves to back up a little bit and go more general, then identifying where we both are, where we both mesh, and meeting there, agreeing to meet there. And then also identifying too, if the relationship can be saved, also understanding when it has to be met. So if I need something from you, and if we're working towards this process as well, then how are we as a group, as a team, right, in this relationship, as a partnership, as a couple, as a friendship, how are we going to measure progress? And allowing people to designate their own measurement of their progress. So one of the things that is very, and Christina, I'm going to stay with your comment for a little bit, but one of the things that often happens if a relationship can be saved is that someone becomes the judge and someone becomes the defendant, right? So if I'm further along in my healing process, I become the judge and I get to judge your actions and your ability to heal, right? Or to meet me and give me what I need. In that moment, in the moment that I become your judge, I am no longer in my healing process, right? Because healing does not include judgment. Healing includes compassion. And so if I'm noticing that I am judging this person like, you know what? They didn't do that right. They didn't do that right. They didn't, versus, okay, well, last week they were here, right? This week they're here. That is a part of their measurement of progress. Each person gets to be allowed to say what they are willing to do differently and how they would like their progress to be measured. And so that involves a lot of communication and transparency, because when we talk about change, one of the things that we have to acknowledge with change is that change is hard just in general for ourselves. And so bringing another person into this equation is even harder. And so how are we as a group going to measure progress? Are we going to check in? And as a part of the progress too, are we going to allow ourselves to give each other positive feedback? One of the things that is very, very hard about unhealthy relationships is that you become conditioned to look for people's faults. That's just a basic thing. You become conditioned to look for people's shortcomings. And so one of the things that often happens is that when people start to change, you judge them on changing for the betterment. And I've talked about this before, right? So, you didn't used to tell me that you love me. And now one day you tell me that you love me. My first response, instead of I love you too, is, oh, now you can tell me you love me. It's about time. I've been waiting 5 years for you to tell me you love me. So now I'm judging you based on your ability to do what it is that I've wanted you to do, right? So that I become that judgment. So I'm taking myself out of that healing process. See, that doesn't sound very healing like, right? So I just want to break that down and give a concrete example. And so if I'm going to stay in a relationship, and if I understand that we're at two different places, because again, that first question, how did we get here? We both got here from two very different life experiences. But if we've committed to, you know what, this relationship is worth saving, we have a basic core foundation that's built in however we both define respect, however we both define honesty, however we both define love, and that is equally yoked, then I'm going to allow you to do your process and hold you accountable by that progress piece too, right? So how are we defining progress? But that's a conversation, and I'm going to withhold judgment in that process, because I want you to hold yourself accountable. When I begin to judge you on your process, again, it takes me out of my process, and it places undue pressure on the person who is trying to change on either end. And then when we talk about the last part of understanding, figuring out whether or not, learning to walk away is for us. The biggest thing for me is understanding the expertise that we all have over our lives, right? So often we have been taught that relationships require a sacrifice of ourselves versus a sacrifice of our egos, right? And I want to say that. So we have been taught. So when we think about how did I get here? A lot of us have been taught that relationships require a sacrifice of ourselves versus a sacrifice of our egos. So thinking about, a good wife does this, right? A good mom does this. A good dad does this. A good partner does this. A good friend does this. And if they take away, if they start to chip at pieces of me versus my ego, then that becomes a problem. So ego is giving up my need to be right? I don't have to be right all the time, but I can still like myself. When I am sacrificing myself, I don't like myself, right? I don't feel comfortable in this position that I'm playing. I don't feel like I'm being myself. How many of us, just give me a thumbs up, have ever gotten out of a relationship and you think back and it's like, I don't even know who that person was, right? I don't even know who that person is. I'm not even that person, right? So when we talk about understanding the expertise that we have over our own lives, understanding if this relationship is requiring us to sacrifice ourselves, who we are, versus our ego. A relationship is going to challenge your ego. A relationship is going to challenge your humility. Yes, that's a good thing, right? I want to be humble. I want to compromise. I want to know that I can keep the peace and be wrong. I want to learn how to effectively apologize. I want to learn how to effectively build up this person that I'm in this relationship with. And then the second part is allowing ourselves, so understanding the expertise we have over our lives. The second takeaway is allowing ourselves time to process and pre-grieve. I'm a big fan of pre-grieving, right? So one of the things that often happens in this event of deciding whether or not a relationship is worth salvaging is that we get very anxious over anticipated loss, anticipated changes. And anxiety and grief are two totally different things, right? So I will be anxious about it, but I'm not actually grieving it. And that grieving a relationship, even if it's an unhealthy relationship, is still allowed. A lot of times too, because so much judgment comes in unhealthy relationships, we don't feel like we should be sad, or I feel like I should be happy that this relationship ended, when it's a person that I cared about, right? I was with you because I cared about you. And Christina, I love what you're saying. The more we heal, the more we learn to love ourselves. And that's the best evolution of all. Yes. And so as we understand this, allowing myself the time to understand that it may not have to be today. I can allow myself to process it. I can allow myself to build up my own internal capacity, or what we call our recovery capital, right? So what capital am I banking on internally that's going to allow me to sustain walking away, or creating new relationships, or allowing myself to experience something different? And so that comes through the lens of honesty and compassion. And the reason why I always pair these two together, to me, you can't have one without the other, because honesty without compassion becomes judgment. And compassion without honesty becomes entitlement, right? So when we allow ourselves the time to process honestly, that means that I allow myself to experience all of the feelings that I'm feeling, right? That means I allow myself to be sad. That means that I allow myself to feel relief. That means I allow myself to be confused and to be angry. I allow myself to feel that. It doesn't mean that I have to behave on or act on anything. It means that I'm just allowing this feeling to be there. And that's that compassion piece, right? So that anger doesn't turn into justification, because again, justification is just going to lead me down a road that I don't want to stay on, right? Because I'm always going to find a reason to be justified in my anger, or be justified in why I'm leaving. If I'm going to leave, I'm going to leave. And so understanding that honesty and compassion allows us to pre-grieve. And then the third takeaway is understanding who our support is. And so, Corcoran, I want to go to your thing. Anxiety is suffering, but grief seems more normal. Like it's natural to be sad because of the loss. But that anxiety comes from not being able to accept the loss. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it comes from also kind of forecasting what I perceive this loss is going to, or the impact I perceive this loss is going to have on my life. And so that may be very true. However, the thing that I always tell other people is, for as bad as it can go, you have to allow it yourself to think about how good it can be too, right? Because anxiety tends to make us look at things from a catastrophic viewpoint, right? So it's going to be all or nothing, right? It's going to be all bad. It's never going to be good. I'm gonna be all alone. I'm not gonna ever have any friends. Nobody's gonna ever come over on Friday nights. I'm not gonna ever do anything else. And so anxiety gets us in that snowballing effect, right? And so part of our work against that is, if I'm going to play out the worst case scenario, self-compassion allows me to play out the best case scenario, right? Self-compassion allows me to play out, okay, what can happen as a result of this? How can I find interesting things out about myself in this process, right? How can I commit to my healing in this process? What do I want my healing to look like in this process? So understanding that if I'm going to go one way, part of that self-compassion piece is involving me bringing it back in and allowing myself to play out the other scenario. And then the third takeaway for tonight is, who is my support, right? So someone or someplace that is going to support my healing and not my anger. I am really big on, if you want to end a relationship, you end it with yourself first before you tell somebody else, unless your safety is at risk. And so the reason why I say that is because we all have people in our lives that you will take, you know what, I don't think I want to be their friend, lover, partner, and they will, I'm coming, you know, and you end up processing their feelings versus processing your feelings. And that's the reason why I say that, right? So we want to, so I remember, and I'll give an example. So I remember when I had made up within my mind that I wanted to transition out of my marriage. And I have a wonderful girlfriend, and you know, you have all these feelings, and you want to do something with them. You want to turn them into words. And she said to me, she said, you know what, you can say whatever it is that you want to say on your last day, right? You can say whatever it is you want to say on your last day of that relationship. And in that moment, I realized that my relationship with my ex, who's now my partner in co-parenting, was never going to end. Which for me then means that, again, that's that ego, right? Which meant for me that there are certain things that I'm never going to say, because that relationship is going to transition into something different, but it's still going to be a very significant part of my life. And because we have a child, and part of my child's life too. And so if I had a different ear at that moment, things could have been very, very left, and could have caused the need for healing from something that we didn't necessarily have to heal from, right? There was already so much healing that needed to be done that would have added another layer that was very unnecessary. And so when we talk about who is my support, someone or someplace that is going to support my healing and not my anger, who are those people? And if I don't have those people in my life, then how can I identify them? And so I'm big on, everyone knows I'm big on counseling, right? I'm big on mental health. I need to bring in someone who's objective. Someone who doesn't have a bias towards me or another person, someone who's going to allow me to get these thoughts out, get these feelings out, so that I can arrive at some kind of conclusion. And that counseling piece can come in at any of those stages, that how did I get here stage, why am I staying stage, or learning to walk away stage. That counseling piece can come in at any of those stages. And understanding too that if abuse is present in the relationship, emotional or physical abuse, they may require notifying places of employment, police, domestic violence programs, understanding, and then that goes into that trauma tolerance too. Understanding that I may have to learn or relearn my notion of violence, right? I may have a trauma tolerance built up to violence, or built up to unhealthiness, or built up to communication. Some of us, have never been in a physical altercation, but those verbal altercations are just as damaging, right? If not sometimes more. And so understanding that there may need to be someone who comes in and teaches me how to communicate effectively, or teaches me when to communicate when I'm feeling a certain emotion. So that is our talk for today. So our 3 takeaway points. Well, let me back up. So our overview of today's session. How did I get here, right? What have I been taught about relationships? What have I been taught about roles in relationships? Am I in a relationship where there's power or partnership? Second part is, why am I staying? Again, I'm big on writing lists, the pros and cons, understanding what are the pros for understanding the pros for staying, and writing them all down, being honest. If it's history, if it's children, if it's friendship, if it's family, if it's societal pressures, whatever they are, I'm putting them on that list. And the third part, learning to walk away and allowing ourselves, if it needs to be, a process versus an event. Learning that I can bring people into that process who are supportive of my healing. And And then our 3 takeaway points: understanding the expertise that we have over our own lives, understanding that healthy relationships may require sacrifice of our ego, but they don't require sacrifice of ourselves, of who we are, allowing ourselves time to process and pre-grieve from a lens of honesty and compassion, and then identifying healthy support systems, either someone or some place that is going to support my healing and not my anger manifesting. Anger is a very healthy emotion, but not my anger, not my, I'll say my justification, because the justification is already there. You can give yourself permission to leave at any time. And so I want to thank you all so much for tuning into this week's episode of Dr. Tara Tuesdays. I hope that it has been helpful. Thank you all so much for sharing, as always, tuning in. I love the Dr. Tara community. And as always, let's heal together. Please join me next week. This will be next Tuesday will be our final segment in the Self-Love is the Best Love series. And I am so excited about it, because that is coming from the I am already enough, right? So often, and I think it's a beautiful segue from tonight's topic. Again, learning to turn from that lens of lack to that lens of abundance. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Peace.